Welcome back to the channel. Today's we will read a story about a man who forced by his parents to give his house for his golden child, younger brother, and his family. Let us begin. I'm a single man in my late 40s, and my brother, let's call him Dan, is 39 with 4 kids. He had his first child at 32, followed by another a year later, then a third 2 years after that, and the fourth was just born a couple of months ago. His wife, Emily, and I do not get along. She often tries to provoke me by acting superior and then turns into a dramatic self-victimizer if I retaliate. She can cry on cue and puts on a convincing show to gain sympathy from others. My parents and brother adore her, even though they know how she really is and don't care. She's attractive, but her awful personality makes it impossible for me to feel any attraction to her. She also refuses to get a job despite having a college degree. And my mother helps with the kids all day, making their finances entirely dependent on my brother. This situation means they can only afford to live in my parents' house, which creates privacy issues with everyone under one roof in a small 3-bedroom house built in the 60s. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. Although we are only 3 years apart, he developed a superiority complex because I was punished severely if I retaliated against his antics. It was clear my parents favored him, giving him the lion's share of everything unless family members called them out on it, which happened often. This led my parents to move us about 150 miles away, so they would only see us during holidays, as it was a 3-hour drive. My brother became physically abusive towards me on several occasions, and relentlessly flirted with my first girlfriend, which ultimately led to her breaking up with me. He laughed at my misfortunes, and whenever I expressed my feelings, my parents told me to suck it up. I only received equal treatment when my parents wanted to maintain appearances. It was almost amusing to see their reactions when they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas, especially when relatives were present. They were very nosy and loved gossip, so my parents did their best to hide the reality of our situation and threatened to take all my belongings away if I spoke out. If anything, my parents celebrated when I turned 18 and moved out because it meant they no longer had to support me. I wasn't even finished with high school when I left, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. I maintained low contact with them after leaving home. They didn't even attend my high school graduation, but I didn't care. From that point on, I usually only saw my parents and brother during holidays, like the rest of the family. The start of the 2020 pandemic was tough for me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job and neither of us could afford the rent on unemployment benefits. I loved that 2-bedroom condo, but as the lease was ending, my roommate left early to move back in with relatives. I had to sell nearly all my belongings because I was about to be homeless if I didn't downsize drastically. I shouldn't have rented such an expensive place, but I enjoyed living the high life until it became unsustainable. I realized I should have chosen a cheaper place to save more money for emergencies. I owned a truck because I've always loved them, so I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck to live in temporarily. I originally hoped to stay at my parents' house, but when I asked them if I could park my camper there, they said they had a full house and didn't want me there. They hadn't gotten along with me in the past decade, and they insisted they would only allow me to park my camper if I paid them the equivalent of rent for an apartment in my area. That was way too much for just parking my camper, especially since I was jobless and trying to save my unemployment money until I found a new job. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to leave since we couldn't come to an agreement. They thought it was hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined in, mocking me and calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck and camper in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night I had nowhere else to go. I felt scared that someone might try to break in, and I didn't sleep well that night. I had no other relatives nearby, and all my friends lived in apartments. I was attached to my area and didn't want to leave. I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment, which was the only way I could still receive it. Finding a stable place to park was difficult. I looked for a job similar to my old one, but it took months of living a nomadic camper life. During that time, I dealt with everything from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be with an HOA, but I wasn't even parked on a street with houses. When I questioned them, they became belligerent and threatened me, so I moved my camper to avoid trouble. To maintain a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in wherever I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's not the best thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bank for recharging my phone, but I didn't have a generator, and those are noisy and require fuel. So, I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to a neighboring city to find a position that didn't involve retail. I had worked retail while in college and promised myself I would never do it again, but I was nearly ready to break that promise. I was still receiving unemployment benefits, but I didn't want to be jobless when they ran out, and I was bored out of my mind. I had little else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I could park and which local public bathrooms I could use. I envied the Japanese for their public bathhouses. We could really use something like that over here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse in old employee parking spaces that no one else seemed to use because they were so far back that the area was borderline forgotten. My boss, the company owner, actually liked this arrangement because I was always available to take any shift I could get, as long as I had enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I wasn't sure if this was legal, but no one bothered us the entire time I lived there. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers. There were a few, but the security guards escorted them out. I was on call almost all the time when they needed me and was working virtually every day of the week. My boss allowed me to plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office except for the janitor and security guard. Beyond that, I usually showered at a friend's apartment or at my local gym since the camper didn't have a shower, only a portable toilet, and I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a nasty chore. I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could go in to use the bathroom at any hour. I was even on a first-name basis with the night security guard, who has since become one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater, but summers were not fun. The camper didn't have AC, so I had to buy a used portable air conditioner just to make it bearable. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway through this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started earning a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I got from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked for something close to my work and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property just 2 miles away. I managed to get it for £10,000 less than the asking price. I used nearly all my savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house to take the camper off and set it up in the backyard. So I put it there as its own little building in case I wanted to use it again. Once I was fully settled in the house, I made the mistake of bragging about it on social media. My family saw the post, and that's where this really starts. After a few weeks, my parents and brother, along with his family, came to visit completely unannounced to tour my home. I didn't even give them my address, so I have no idea how they found out where I live. None of my friends have fessed up, and no prior family members visited me before that. So I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home. It wouldn't surprise me. Once I opened the door, they practically shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists and started making themselves at home. They kept poking around, and Emily had this creepy smirk that she kept flashing me. It was only later that I figured out why, and it made me angrier than I could express. My parents constantly talked about how I had so much extra space now and that it was too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. My brother kept remarking about how there was more space than our parents' house and that my house was closer to his job. Red flags were everywhere. Eventually, my brother asked me to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out onto the front porch. That's when I realized they had planned something. My brother said the house was too much for me alone and suggested that he and his family move in with me because his wife is pregnant with their 4th child, and my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already have the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they lived in the main house. I'd like to point out that he never once mentioned offering to pay rent. Mind you, he has a good job. He also started talking about how there would be changes and even curfews, and that I couldn't just walk in at any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I would think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But he'd lost his marbles long ago thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I would rent my house or parts of it to him. I might consider renting to other people to help pay the mortgage, but certainly not him or his awful wife. I had heard of this exact kind of situation in videos online many times and never thought I would actually live it because it seemed so ludicrous. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic, entitled crazies. So I picked up my phone and started recording. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I was doing this. He just sat there, waving his arms around while talking about all the reasons he needed my house. Then he acted like it was a done deal and tried to reach out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally stood my ground and said, "Hell no." I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I rarely ever raised my voice to him because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, not theirs. I stood firm and told him that my house was not up for grabs. Acting like I would let him move in just because they wanted it wouldn't make it happen. I bought my house for myself, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to live with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me and said that I didn't deserve the house, and that he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed in his face and told him that was ridiculous because I worked hard to buy my house. Of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I had no wife or kids and didn't need all the space, so I might as well give it to him. I told him I wasn't giving him anything, and he never even offered to pay me rent if I let him move in. I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in it. Dan told me he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first and that our parents said I was going to do this. I yelled back, as if their word was law, and told Dan that they didn't have the right or power to give my house to him. Then I turned to my parents and told them to get out. I would call the police if they didn't leave right away. My mother screamed the loudest at me, saying she was pregnant again and I couldn't do this to her. I told her I hadn't done anything to her. She just assumed she could take from me as if I would allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. I called her a stuck-up who never respected me, so I didn't care what she thought or how many kids she had. I had no sympathy for her. She wouldn't be living in my house. That made her angry enough to attack me. She landed one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back. Kicking and screaming, she demanded he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded everything, so I held it up and said I would call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents told Dan they were leaving, and my mother said I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I wouldn't and not to come back. I warned my sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything, and if she tried anything, I would press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out, crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door, telling me I better do this for my brother. I responded by saying I wouldn't. And that's the end of part 1. What do you think of the story so far? Do you have input for the writer? Let me know in the comments.